So, so the the first, well, there are a couple just caveats that I'm just going to give about numbers in general in the Hebrew Bible. So the first caveat I'm going to give is that whenever you read numbers in the Hebrew Bible, especially if they are large, but it's going to apply to small numbers too. Especially if numbers are large, you should already come to the text thinking that they're rounded. So it is the normal practice of the Hebrew Bible of large numbers to use approximations. So yeah, it's just that's just how, right? That's just how Hebrew culture was. They would round numbers often. And like I said, usually this is true with very large numbers, but it doesn't have to be. So, for example, so in Hebrew, like if you want to say, so it's similar to like the word several, right, in English. If there are a number of objects that are they're too many to readily count, like right off the hand, right, or just right yeah, they're too many to readily count. We just use like the word several, right? There's like let's say I walk down to a river and I pick up a bunch of pebbles in my hand, or small rocks or whatever. I'll just say I picked up several stones, right? And for those of us in English, we understand what is meant, right? By using the word several, right? We understand that it's not a great quantity, but it's more than you can count readily, right? It's more than 3 or 4. So then the number 10 is used this way in Hebrew, right? If in ancient Hebrew, if you are wanting to communicate this idea of more than can readily be counted, you just estimate that there's 10. But it doesn't mean there's exactly 10. It just means, right, there's too many. Does that make sense how I described that? It's kind of a difficult thing to describe. What I'm saying is that, right, we in modern culture, we have other words that we use to communicate approximations. We don't choose a specific numeral value that fulfills that function. That's different in Hebrew, right? So Hebrew, right, like the number 10 fulfills this function as it's a catch-all, right, for ones that are so that's just important to understand. Okay, so the other thing, and this is a little more uncomfortable to talk about, right? The other thing is that there are numbers in the Old Testament that there's no other way to describe it, that they're just wrong. So for example, the most famous example is if you read in the books of Samuel, in the books of Samuel, if you're reading the Hebrew text, you get to this point and it says that Saul reigned for 2 years. Right. 2 years he reigned as king, which is like clearly contradictory to all of the rest of the narrative. And so, right, if you read commentaries about this particular place, what they say is what I think is perfectly reasonable explanation, is that there's a number missing in that text there, right? When the original author penned that, they didn't write 2, they wrote something else. But we don't know what they wrote, because over making manuscript copies, people make mistakes. And so right, I would not be doing my duty as a scholar, right, to handle the Old Testament correctly, to not acknowledge that there are some places where the actual text we have in front of us when it comes to numbers are just inaccurate. Like, we know that they're inaccurate because they're not consistent with each other. And how I, as a person who believes in the inspiration of Scripture, right, what I say is, right, I believe that these works were inspired in their original autographs, right? When the original author wrote them down, that's what was inspired. But in the process of copying, right, this does introduce mistakes into right, human copying introduces mistakes into the text. And I am perfectly comfortable perfectly comfortable with that. That doesn't threaten my view of the truth of scripture. It just means that they're right, they're copying errors.